Hi. So we continue our discussion on public policy, and today's topic is theory of public goods and public policy. In today's session we would cover externalities, free rider problem, public goods and why government provides public goods. As mentioned in the previous session, public policy deals with failures. Public goods theory helps in determining the scope of governmental activity or for what kind of provisions the government may intervene if it plans to do that. Public goods theory indicates why goods with the characteristics of publicness cannot be produced efficiently by the private sector of the economy, creating a market failure which implies a role for the government in the production of those goods for which the market fails. But before discussing public goods theory in detail, let us look at some important concepts. First is externalities. In the previous session we discussed that a state may intervene through the instrument of public policy when there is a market failure. Market failure refers to the inefficient distribution of goods and services in the free market. In a typical free market, the prices of goods and services are determined by the force of supply and demand. However, price distortion or market failure may occur due to several reasons. One of the important factors is the externalities that affect the pricing. Externalities are a consequence of an industrial or commercial activity which affects other parties without this being reflected in the market prices. In other words, an externality is a cost or benefit caused by a producer that is not financially incurred or received by that producer. An externality can be both positive and negative and can happen in either the production or consumption of good or service. For example, many industries discharged effluents in open drains or rivers without treating them when environmental regulations were weak in India. This helped them keep the price of their products lower, which benefited the consumers too. However, the cost of consequent water pollution had to be borne by the whole society. If the effluent had to be treated before discharging, its cost would have reflected in the cost of the good produced. This is negative externality. A positive externality occurs if the production and consumption of a good or service benefits a third party not directly involved in the market transaction. For example, education directly benefits the individual and also provides benefits to society as a whole through the provision of some more informed and productive citizens. Then the next important concept is free riders problem. Sometimes it is not possible to prevent anyone from enjoying a good once it has been provided. Therefore, there is no incentive for people to pay for the good because they can consume it without paying for it. Most popular example is that of a lighthouse on the coast to serve as a navigational aid. As a result, all sailors benefit from this lighthouse even if they are not paying towards its upkeep. Now we discuss one of the two parameters which are important in understanding public goods. First is jointness in consumption. Jointness in consumption means that once a good is produced for one person, additional consumer can consume the good without reducing the consumption of any existing consumer. Joint consumption goods are also sometimes referred to as collective consumption goods or non-rival consumption goods. Its opposite is a rivalrous consumption, in which the consumption or use of the good or service by one person reduces the availability of the good or service to another person. And the second concept is excludability. Can some be excluded from consuming a good? A good or service is called excludable if it is possible to prevent people or customers who have not paid for it from having access to it. By comparison, a good or service is non-excludable if non-paying consumers cannot be prevented from accessing it. Please look at this matrix. It is in terms of the two parameters that we have discussed. One is the rivalrous consumption or jointness of consumption, and the second is excludability. And this matrix helps us in understanding the four types of goods. There are four types of goods, as you can see: private goods, toll goods, common pool resources and public goods. Now we see the characteristics of each of these. First, private goods. As you can see in the matrix, a product or service produced by a privately owned business and purchased to increase the utility or satisfaction of the buyer. Pure private goods are both excludable and rivalrous, where excludability means that producers can prevent some people from consuming the good or service based on their ability or willingness to pay, and rivalrous indicates that one person's consumption of a product reduces the amount available for consumption by another. Private goods producers will underproduce in the presence of positive externalities. because the costs of production for the firm are overstated and the profits are understated. To adjust for externalities, governments may tax those who create negative externalities and subsidize those who create positive externalities. Second is public good. As you can see in the matrix, a public good is a good that once produced can be consumed by an additional consumer at no additional cost, and that consumers cannot be excluded from consuming the public good once it is produced. Goods with these characteristics will be underproduced in the private sector or may not be produced at all. It is often, though not always, underprovided in a free market because its characteristics of non-rivalry and non-excludability mean there is an incentive not to pay. In a free market, firms may not provide the good as they have difficulty charging the free riders. Third type of goods is tall goods. A club or tall good is excludable but non-rivalrous, at least to a point when congestion occurs. A toll road or a museum are examples of this type of good. Users must pay for the opportunity to use the road or enter the museum. Individuals may be excluded if they do not pay. And finally, the fourth one, common pool resource. A common pool resource is a resource that has most of the characteristics of a pure private good, but that is owned in common by many people, such as the members of a community. Common pool resources are sometimes called common resources or just commons. It is rivalrous but non-excludable. In other words, the supply can be depleted, but people are not restricted in their use of the good. Natural resources like forests can be thought of as common goods. Their supplies are not infinite, but their utilization benefits all. Common goods, because they all are limited, but largely available to all, are susceptible to the tragedy of commons. What is this tragedy of commons? A classic example of common pool resources is given by Garrett Hardin. A common was a community owned pasture that anyone in the village could use for grazing their livestock. People quickly noticed that the commons were overgrazed relative to nearby private pastures. This occurred because people using the commons had no incentive to reduce their use of the commons in order to preserve some grass for tomorrow and next week, because someone else could bring in livestock to graze in the meantime. Anything preserved for the future by one person would not necessarily be available to that person in the future. So there was no incentive to conserve or protect the resource from overuse. So finally, when government provides public goods, so nature of externalities and the free riders problem determine the scope of government action. At the same time, there could be some contestations also. Let us take one example. Healthcare may be provided more efficiently as a private good, but the poor and those without health insurance may be unable to afford it. Many argue that access to healthcare is a human right and that it should thus be provided by the government as a public good. Issues such as these illustrate the trade-off between efficiency and equity and highlight the need for public policy to determine which private goods should be public goods. Let us take another example. A radio broadcast is a joint consumption good. One person can listen to the broadcast, and if an additional listener turns on her radio, no existing listener has to give up any consumption of the broadcast. The radio broadcast is a good example because it not only illustrates the concept of jointness in consumption, but also shows that public goods do not have to be produced in the public sector alone. So all these concepts combined together help us understand as to how the goods and services can be provided efficiently and by whom, and what determines the government intervention and when. Thank you.